Welcome to the second half of the Jane Austen lecture. Jane Austen, romantic or reactionary? And this half of the lecture will focus on the romantic part. Okay, when does Romanticism with a capital R start? Some would say it starts in 1798 with the publication of Lyrical Ballads, which is a work of poetry by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Others might say it strikes part in 1789 with the start of the French Revolution. But we can say definitely somewhere in the 1790s, this cultural literary movement starts to take place. When does it end? It ends between 1827 and 1832. 1832 is the date of the first reform bill in England, which will empower the middle class. It's definitely over by 1837, though, which is when Queen Victoria ascends to the throne, and her name will be given to the next literary movement, which basically encompasses that part of the 19th century, Victorianism. Who are some of the major writers in Romanticism? And now, you do not need to write all these names down. You might have heard these names before. I want to give you a context for these names, but you don't have to write all this stuff down. Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Byron, Southey, Felicia Hemans, Letitia Landon. It's not just guys. There are very important female poets working within this period. And in prose fiction, Jane Austen, for sure, Sir Walter Scott, Mary Shelley, writes Frankenstein, married to Percy Shelley, daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft. So these are some of the major literary figures in the Romantic period. We talked a little bit about the Industrial Revolution when I was talking about the rise of the novel. And again, do not write all this stuff down. I just want you to see these inventions in the 18th century, this use of science, this focus on progress, this powers the textile industry. This will make factories possible. This will all make it possible for England to shift from an agrarian economy and an agrarian society to a society that is built on manufacturing. This is the Industrial Revolution. And it's a big upheaval. That's what I'll say. It's a huge upheaval. We will also get new forms of power. We talked about this also with Rise of the Novel. Lighting, gas street lighting. 1807, London gets gas street lights. You're going to have, with the rise of manufacturing in this Industrial Revolution, right? We're going to move from people living in the country to living in the city. Those people are going to need lights. Speaking of living in the country and living in the city, when I said this was a big upheaval, it's really big. In 100 years, we will go from 10% of Britons living in a city to 50%. Dramatic cultural change. It's not just cultural change. It's not just the Enlightenment. It's not just the economy. It's also very political. We have the French Revolution, 1789, coming right on the heels of that American Revolution. A time of revolution. The French Revolution will devolve into the Reign of Terror, and the kind of political upheaval and instability in France will allow Napoleon to consolidate power and become what the English would certainly consider a tyrant. Reactions to the French Revolution. Initially, in England, we have some positive reactions from various thinkers. People like Thomas Paine, who was also pretty positive about the American Revolution. Mary Wollstonecraft, Wordsworth. As the French Revolution will turn into the Reign of Terror, of course, you will have less positive reactions and much more sympathy for the French monarchy and the aristocracy. There are important negative reactions. Edmund Burke is a historian and a very important historian and philosopher, and he is going to feel pretty negatively about this just overturning of institutions and conventions and things like that. With the rise of Napoleon, we get the Napoleonic Wars. So for over 10 years, England is going to be at war with France on and off in a variety of theaters. Never England, although England was very worried about being invaded. They were worried that Napoleon would try and conquer them. And he super wished he could, but he did not. In part because his navy is defeated decisively. But Napoleon is this constant military threat. And the Napoleonic Wars in Europe will eat up a lot of England's attention and concern and money. There are domestic implications to this. England sometimes suspends the right of habeas corpus, free press, free speech, petition, assembly. We will see this in Jane Austen's novels with the presence of the soldiers. When people are thinking about, oh, the soldiers, the regiment is moving, this is happening. Well, why are there all these soldiers and what are they doing? They're being moved around because of the Napoleonic Wars, and that's why we're talking about them. We will also see, when we get to Persuasion, we'll see some discussion of the Navy, but we're not going to have like day-to-day updates on, oh, this is what happened in the war, this is what happened in the war. For a long time, this was a criticism of Jane Austen's works that she's writing during this incredible period of dramatic military upheaval, but it's not really reflected in her writing. But I would only ask you to think about your own daily life. America has been at war for a very long time. We are at war right now in Afghanistan, and yet I'm sure that you don't feel like on a daily basis you are constantly aware and thinking of this, of us as being at war. So this is also considered the Regency period. You may have heard this called the Regency period. And that's because between 1811 and 1820, Prince George, whose nickname is Prinny, functions as the Prince Regent because George III is insane. George III, the antagonist of the American Revolution, right? The people we demanded our freedom from, is become insane, and his son, who is portrayed in this cartoon. This cartoon is a picture of Prinny, is ruling in his stead. You can tell from the picture, Prinny is a man of appetites. He was pretty fat. He loved food, he loved drinking, he was a man of various appetites. He loved gambling, he was always broke, he spent a ton of money on really fancy clothes, he had mistresses, he was a kind of scandalous person. George III dies, Prinny becomes George IV. When he dies without an heir, his younger brother is crowned, and this is eventually how we get to Queen Victoria. But the thing to note, for all of his scandalous ways, Prinny is also a huge Jane Austen fan. He said that all of her works needed to be in every one of his royal residences so that whenever he wanted to, he could read a Jane Austen novel. He was such a fan that she was essentially forced to dedicate one of her novels to him because he's definitely not the kind of person she would have approved of. But yes, a fun fact about Prince George is that he was a big Jane Austen fan. Okay, that's the cultural, historical, political kind of background for this period. A moment of just huge upheaval. We're in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. People are moving from the city to the country. It's a time of military upheaval. The monarchy of England is not rock solid as the king is insane and his black sheep son is ruling in his stead. It's just a time of kind of crazy upheaval. And so here are the literary elements that we're going to see Romantic authors be concerned with. A belief in the natural goodness of man. A commitment to emotion. Wordsworth will call this emotion recollected in tranquility. But where our neoclassicists loved reason, our romanticists will love emotion. They will reject reason in favor of emotion, kind of, essentially. They're also interested in the power of the imagination. Remember, classicists said, no, don't be original. Imitate something else. Ho, ho, ho. Romantics are going to be original. They're going to see themselves as visionaries and as prophets. Keats will specifically talk about the power of the imagination in a very powerful way. They focus on the self and individualism and independence. And this does come straight out of that Enlightenment philosophy, but it's just turned up to 11 for the Romantics. And this is a criticism of them, that they are too egocentric, that they are solipsistic. I mean, that's a criticism. They saw it as, a very important focus on individualism. Other elements of Romanticism: a turn away from overly formal artistic elements and choosing everyday language over poetic diction. As you read the Wordsworth poem for Friday, I want you to compare it to the Pomfret poem that you read for Wednesday and think about which of these poems is easier to read. Spontaneity, just being moved by your emotions, going with the flow. Romantics really valued that. Political support for liberty. They overall, with some notable exceptions, and people certainly changed their mind later, but most Romantics supported what at the time were left-leaning causes like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, things like that. Interest in the exotic or the primitive. Far off lands, different places, older times. Romantics are very interested in that. The power of the sublime, which I will talk a little bit about in class. The sublime is a mixture of delight and terror. We might think of it as awe, like true awe. They were very interested in how and what can produce that feeling. And they were incredibly interested in nature and the supernatural. Nature is connected to the sublime. But also, if we talk about this change from an agrarian culture to a manufacturing culture and the environmental depredations that would ensue in England, what was happening to nature, people's connection to nature, all of those things, they're completely interested in. So think about this as you read the poems that we have for Friday. And I will see you in class.